And we have a relatively small team, given the size of our agency, because I do have some neuroscientists. I am a neuroscientist from a long time ago, but our job actually isn't to develop our own methods. It's mainly to investigate what's out there and investigate what exists, what's genuine, what's validated, but most importantly, what can tell us something that we don't already know. And I'd say just a slight thing in defence of traditional research is to make sure that you know the nature of the shark that you think you're fighting, because actually a lot of this work is now being done in traditional research agencies because it tells us something else. And who wouldn't want more data to be able to give clients better recommendations? So we now do not do copy testing that doesn't involve neuroscience. Clients can't come to us and say, I want a copy test without neuroscience. We just won't. It's not something we do. It's something that's a core part of any test. It's something that clients don't pay more for. It's just a part of it. And as such, like, this industry is hugely important to us and to the future of traditional research. And I'd hate for us to just be seen as the outsider when actually so much of the work that we want to do is together and helping just to integrate the best data sources that we can, regardless of where they come from. And so, where we are now, as I say, neuroscience is now a key part of a lot of the copy tests, well, all of the copy tests that we do, with one exception. So we did discover that trying to do facial coding on all female samples in Saudi Arabia, where all of the women wear full-face veils, is not a good thing. And we only discovered this after a team had done it. And they got a line, and the line went like this. And they did it again, and they got a line, and the line went like this. At which point we said, what do you think is going to, what do you think you're measuring? And they said, oh, we thought it was magic, and we thought we could see through the veils. So it's not magic, and if your target sample is people that are very conservative Muslims and don't want to remove their face veils, then you are accepted from having to do neuroscience. If you're not, you're going to get it. So we're now up to, I think actually yesterday I looked and it's about 12,000 projects now, for thousands of different brands and lots of big clients in lots of markets. So we start doing this stuff at big scale. And I think that's actually where we can start to contribute something back to the industry by looking at what you can learn when you do things on a huge scale. So we test a lot of TV ads, we test a lot of very good ads, we test a lot of very bad ads. And one of the things that we sort of started to notice over the course of incorporating facial coding into this was that there seemed to be a pattern emerging that if you had a narrative arc in your ad, so a story that progressed as the ad went on, you were more likely to generate emotion than ads that didn't. The ads that were just vignettes or clips of unrelated action. And we thought, hey, there's something in this. And so I got a team of people who loved me for it to go through a whole series of ads. So we took about 400 ads and to code up across those ads, regardless of whether they were good, bad, whether they had a progressive narrative arc or not. And we thought, if we code up a load of ads without a bias of whether it's good or bad, we'll be able to see whether there was something actually special about stories or whether it's just that good stories make good ads. Because a lot of the time you see a good case study, people attribute a lot of the success of it to the ad having a good story, but very rarely do people stand up and say this ad was bad because it didn't have a story. So what we did is we took nearly 400 ads, which I've worked out is about 57,000 people that have been recorded over this. And we just split them into story ads and non-story ads. And that's the only distinction we made. And they all had survey data and facial coding data for emotional responses. There's a big problem is what is a story? We went and we looked at a lot of academic literature about what's a story, what constitutes a plot versus... There's a lot of competing theories, but from our point of view, the thing that we've noticed is that what we were considering a story is a sequence of events that are linked in time, so they have to occur in a certain order in order to make sense, but with a chain of causality running through them. So, to borrow a lovely example from E.M. Forster, the king died, then the queen died, is a series of events that are linked in time. The king died, then the queen died of grief, has that chain of causality. And so this was the brief we gave to people to go and look at ads. I don't care whether it's good or bad or what the ad's for, just tell me whether the things in the ad were dependent on things before them and led to some kind of conclusion. And what we found is probably of those 400 ads-ish, about 100 of them have a story, and about 300 didn't. So we thought we'd then have just a quick look at the summary metrics of what stuff did ads differentiate themselves on when they did have a story. So the first thing that stories did really well was engage people. And engagement, as we've talked about, is one of those terms that gets bandied around a lot. What I mean by engagement is that ads both generated more emotions of any sort. So the average level of emotion when someone was watching an ad with a story in was significantly higher than without a story. And then their rating of that ad, having seen it, was significantly more active than ads without the story. And what I mean by that is they're much more likely to rate the ad, whether good or bad, with a term like disturbing or involving than gentle or passive. So it's about how engaged they felt with that ad, not necessarily how much effort they put in when watching it, but how engaged. And we know from looking across actually about 4,000 of the ads that expressiveness, the average amount of expressions you pull at all, relates strongly to our best measure of how well your creative is going to cut through. And that measure of how well the creative cuts through relates strongly to sales. So these are good things to be aiming for. They're not the only things, but they're very good things to be aiming for, and it looks like stories can help with that. The second thing that stories do well is evoke specific emotions. So stories become really good vehicles for delivering a particular emotional message. So when you look at the individual emotions, you get both positive emotions, so the average amount of smiles is higher in a story ad, but also some negative ones. The average amount of disgust is also higher in story ads than non-story ads. And this isn't some weird quirk of facial coding, because you get the same thing mirrored in surveys. That people will generally say that they enjoy an ad with a story. I'm not good with these microphones. That they say they'll enjoy an ad with a story, but they also say that they will describe more ads with stories as repelling than ads without stories. So they're just better at generating emotion. And I think this was a bit of a surprise to us, that it also was better at eliciting negative emotions, until you start looking at which negative emotions it elicits. Because frowns don't show this pattern. And when you look on a broader scale, frowns in relation to advertising are much more indicative of an ad not being successful than disgust is. Disgust has no relation to ad success. And actually, the thing that it seems to relate most to is the creative style. And I think if you think about it, it makes sense, because it's very difficult to leave someone feeling accidentally disgusted with an advertiser. So if you've induced disgust in someone, it is probably because that was a necessary part of your story. So you might be making an ad for toilet cleaner, where you show disgusting, grimy toilets, and then your wonderful toilet cleaner comes in and saves the day. That's going to induce disgust. It's very unlikely that an ad that people think, oh, I don't like this, is going to have the same kind of active engagement. But it's not just about the overall levels, which relates to some of the stuff we were hearing about with humour yesterday. That actually, one of the measures that was most indicative of stories versus non-stories, or most prevalent, was that actually it wasn't about your overall level of your line, it was about how much the emotions moved during the ad.
And to demonstrate where we are with the ROI prediction, this is mostly around online video. So I'm using this word social there, it means many different things, but depending on who you talk to. But what I'm really talking about is sort of pull marketing. I think that's the broader term, because we do work a lot with research community, but we also work with very leading ad agencies and big brands directly. And many of them share this common desire. It's like, how can I actually get people to choose to watch my content, want to share it, rather than me just buying a TV spot and getting people to watch that? Because the media has changed, right? The consumer has so many options to do whatever they want. So really that is the way to get to the clients. And I think that's where the existing methods so far in industry have come most short as well, because online sets its own requirements on speed and economics that don't really apply for the existing methods so far. And the other thing is, and this is still very first baby steps, but the smartest marketers that we have the pleasure to work with are asking this question, is like, do we really need these GRPs and impressions and these huge numbers of buying media against that? Or do we really need concrete amount of actions? And I think that, of course, they want the latter, because that's where the business value comes in. But the methods have maybe come a bit short on that, because this is not a new issue, right? You know, I'm not a historian, an economic historian, but what I know is that John Wanamaker was the first guy to make an ad and put it in the newspaper, and as soon as he did it, he also came up with this very well-known saying that, you know, some of it is working, some of it is not. Which half, I don't know. So there's 140 years since that claim, and billions of dollars are spent every year on trying to tackle that problem. But everybody can make their own assessment that, you know, there's no complete data available on it, but we're probably much worse today. I don't think, you know, is really half the money working, what you spend on marketing? Because the problem has gotten so much more complex, right? You used to have just a newspaper and an ad, now you have thousands of connection points, different ad formats. And of course, you know, not all of it is working. So this is the challenge right now. And part, you know, of the problem has been the feedback. So we're all talking about those neuro methods, and that's how people are really driven and how the decisions work, but the reality, take any industry report, 95% is this. I mean, whether it's asking questions, whether it is doing interviews, focus groups, it is still that. And yes, we know, and we all say that it's incomplete, but it is the reality, and the sort of the absolute size of it is still changing. So feedback is part of the problem, the way it's being collected. And I want to make a point here that it really, that's probably what quite a few people who think about neuro don't do, is take the whole view across from start to finish, right? So pretty much all of the discussions are early, sort of pre-stage testing, how to predict that things are working well. But there's this other part which really affects marketing, which is around targeting and measuring what really works. And that's, you know, neuro itself is very small if you think about, you know, how stuff gets done, but this area is almost not covered at all. So it all sits there in the beginning, which makes sense. That's where you can have the biggest impact of the actual change of the outcomes. But there's this huge potential where neuro does not exist today at all. And again, I'll come back to that point later in my final slides to show a few things there as well. But how do you get there? Again, back to the prediction, back to the ROI point. So this is what the number one issue for us is keep working at that, I realize. So just to give you a bit of a sense of the data here, I think it's useful to understand this as well. It's like if you know, first to really, it's really about long tail events, right? Because you either have the success or not. I mean, it's not a linear line. So you need to understand that when you look at the different models of trying to figure out what exactly you want to use. And you know, that's the world out there. There's so much content. You either break through or you don't. So it's really is win or lose situation. So you're looking for those signals which really make that big difference, not some little nuances. The other thing is that, you know, these are all different metrics, but they're quite strongly correlated to each other. And the correlation point goes further as well, and I think that's maybe something for others to consider as well, that success is success, right? You know, the data about how social success is related to brand linkage, share of voice, profits, all of that, it's still very hazy, but it is there. So if you don't have any other data to validate against, that's the first step for anybody to prove their methods to go against. And that's one of the reasons we picked the social data set as well. Now I already made that point that the emotion data itself is very rich. So just to give you an overview of what we really work with is that we measure all the basic emotions, the Ekman ones that everybody knows. We have aggregate ones like neutral, balance, engagement. We can measure attention, are people looking on a screen? Are they leaning in? Are they leaning backwards? We get estimated heart rate. So there's a lot of starting measures that we start to work with when we're looking for important signals. And then there's this fact that, you know, there's this trends over time, right? You know, how fast does the emotion change? What's slow? What kind of directions it adds? And concrete events in terms of how many people feel what emotion, how intensely. So you're literally talking about tens of thousands of different measures that can go into the analytics in terms of figuring out what are the key signals. And that's why the size of the database is so important, because then you can really start to see what works on scale. This is getting very geeky now, and I promise I'm getting out of this pretty soon. Just, you know, there are different methods. So again, there are different metrics, and there are different metrics in terms of how to get the prediction formulas out. And we constantly run them in our data science pipeline to see which ones perform the best. And for some metrics, you have some things work better than the others. And overall, I mean, what I picked here is just one of those models that shows how these different emotions actually have relative weight in terms of being able to predict what people are going to actually do online after watching the videos. And what we've also been able to do is to compare those different methods. So we have above, you know, in terms of the self-reported measures that we're comparing against, this is not like some expensive 15-minute survey. We're talking about 4 questions there about do you like it, will you share it? So asking people questions, of course, gets you a good signal as well. But the point is that, you know, you can get more from emotions, even if you look at, you know, the top 12 of most of those, the strongest ones. And then if you really use the whole big model of, you know, 500 different variables or so, you get to as high areas under the curve performance as that. So this is to show you where we are with those binary performances. And one of the, you know, strongest models that we had was specifically for YouTube likes, and we have those for all the social metrics. And just to describe you what's going on here, you can see what kind of patterns are the most likely to drive success. And I found interesting Sarah's point that they haven't seen relationship between disgust and success, and maybe it's because you've done a bit more work on TV and we tend to be doing in online, because in online you're kind of a bit bolder with the videos, so things like Devil Baby, maybe you know those videos. I mean, they're pretty disgusting, but they at the same time they really perform well, getting the views, getting the people to go to the cinema. So because of that, I think we have that sort of popping up a bit higher in our models for the time being. And again, this model self-learns, right? Every video we test, every new data we pull in, these weights will change. So basically, based on all of this complex stuff and it's really going to get simpler from here onwards, we've built now a model. So it's a very complex model. It cannot be really described in terms of do this, do that. It's pure data science.
The neural basis of creativity, and I was going to link those two things, but in the interest of time, etc., I have in fact changed it, and I'm suggesting probably something more relevant and and also a talk that can be fitted in better in the amount of time available, which is, does creative advertising mean effective advertising? Now, there are going to be a few points about definitions here. What do we mean by effective? So let's start off with some common observations that have been made. Many, if not all, of the most commercially effective advertising, let's start off with television advertising, produced over the last few decades, has been highly creative. However, it's been recognised that the established research methodologies, particularly copy testing, have, maybe until recently, tended to perform relatively poorly when looking at highly creative, groundbreaking ads. And in this presentation, I'd like to discuss what can neuroscience methodology offer in terms of examining highly effective advertising. Now, there are numerous methodologies. The one that we have focused on for a number of years and published on is a methodology which is termed steady-state topography. It relies on measuring electrical activity of the brain. It's not EEG, it's what's called an evoked potential methodology. And essentially, it measures the change in information processing speed by measuring changes in the delay of information on a fraction of a second by second. If things are happening faster, that's an indication of underlying increased activity. If things are happening slower, less activity. And that's the measure. And we've done this for a reason, and if there's a question, I'll be happy to expand on that. It has certain advantages. We don't have time for that now. The other point to note, of course, which has been well recognised, is that the cortex, the cerebral cortex, is not just uniform the same. There are regions which specialise for different functions. For example, the occipital cortex back here is primarily involved with visual processing. So if one records in the vicinity of the occipital region, one will be looking at the activity of the occipital cortex, and hence increased activity will we define as increased visual attention. And there are other regions, and I'll talk about the other measures which are drawn from other regions of the skull. So the major measures that we work with, long-term memory encoding, and this is going to be one of the most important ones, so I'm going to focus on that one in terms of advertising effectiveness, where effectiveness is defined not in terms of tracking studies, but actually in terms of consumer behaviour. Long-term memory encoding, as I said, what is actually going into long-term memory, irrespective whether it's conscious or unconscious. Left hemisphere tends to be associated with encoding information about detail, text, factual information. Right hemisphere much more associated with imagery, global features, but also rhythm, as well as some of the emotional colours as well. And this is well based on literature. Engagement, some of you who heard me speak on the first day, we regret using the term engagement. It's one of the most biggest terms. In our case, what it really does mean is activity in that prefrontal, particularly ventromedial, these regions of the brain which are associated with what's called self-referential processes. If you're thinking about yourself, for example, you're thinking about related. Quite often, if you're daydreaming, these regions become active, and essentially it's a sense of personal relevance. So that's the basis of why we're looking at the long-term memory encoding and branding as our measure of advertising effectiveness. So one of the factors which influences advertising effectiveness is what we've termed conceptual closure. Now, I'm going to show you, this is a campaign, I think it was 2013. It was a Toshiba campaign. I think it certainly won a Cannes line. And it was an example of basically, I think, 6 or 7 6-minute segments of a story of essentially the same person, or maybe many different people, ultimately looking for love. I think they were presented on either successive evenings or successive, I didn't actually see it myself, or successive evenings or successive weeks. But basically it was a story. It would have been an example, I suspect, where the client went to the agency and said, I want a really emotional ad, I want a really breakthrough ad, in which they said, terrific, we'll give you six-minute segments. And this is just how it starts. There is 6 minutes of data. You'll see two traces, one at about 0.3, one at about 0.7. The 0.7 one is our 65th percentile, sorry, 70th percentile. If the trace is above that, then the information tends to be well encoded. It's what you're looking for, particularly at those points of branding. Not at all of them, just the points of branding. The red trace is the left hemisphere, detailed especially, and also particularly with new campaigns. The blue trace is the right hemisphere, the imagery, the emotional components, etc. And as I said, this is heavily smooth, and we're going to see what happens near the end. But let me just start playing and hopefully it will play.
She's gonna be disappointed later. That's one of my rules. Always leave before they wake up. And I need lots of rules. Without them.
Now, with that, you see essentially different characters, and the same theme is the search for love and yet the fear of intimacy, etc. It's really quite moving. What I want to do is focus on the last 30 or so seconds of that, where people sort of say, well, that's it, or you'll see what they say. This particular point.
And that's what it's like. That's how it goes. Every time.
And that's it for me.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Well, that's it for me.
What I want to describe there is the first, well, that's it from me, as if to say, this is the end of the story. You'll notice there was a dip in memory, but the really dramatic one occurred right at the end, where it was quite clear that was the end of the story. And that drop in memory encoding at the end of a narrative, at the end of a sequence, we've termed conceptual closure. And we've drawn on cognitive neuroscience research, which looks at the way time-extended experiences are stored in the brain. They're not stored as a continuous loop, they're stored as discrete events. And the brain basically segments these events at what we call event boundaries. So when you get to an event boundary, that's the end of one story, the beginning of something else, there's a momentary drop in memory encoding that's a little bit similar to what's called the attentional blink, as the resources are allocated to packaging that, if you will. And as I said, we've termed that conceptual closure. Anything which suggests this is the end of one segment or another, such as a white screen coming up at the end, or a car even receding into the distance, or even symbolically a handshake.